As I implied in the last lecture, there were terrible events in the last decades of the 19th century that shook the progressive, rationalist core of Europeans and gave rise to irrational solutions. It's important now to look in more detail at the social, political, and economic events of these last years of the century, or as they have come to be known, the Fin de Siècle. These events are significant if we're to understand the system of competing alliances and the drift towards war in 1914, and also the state of Europe as the century changed. Let's begin with France. During the Third Republic that followed the collapse of Napoleon III's Second Empire after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. In the last great battle of that war, Napoleon III and 100,000 of his troops were captured at Sedan. Napoleon was imprisoned by the Germans, and he died just 2 years later. The French state at the time of the defeat was thrown into complete chaos. The empire was abolished, though most Frenchmen had supported it in one way or another, and a provisional republican government, the Government of National Defense, assumed temporary authority over France, led by Adolphe Thiers. However, in defeat, the trade unions, the International, and members of the local government of Paris, that is, the Paris Commune, if you remember the time of the French Revolution, the reorganization of French government at all levels, the municipal government then became the Commune. The French municipal government refused to acknowledge either the old imperial or the new provisionary republican central government. The people of Paris, cut off from the rest of the country by the Prussians, refused to admit defeat. And they called up a national guard of 250,000 men, as France had in 1792 and 1793, in order to protect the city. In the countryside, despite the military defeat at Sedan, the French waged guerrilla warfare against the Prussians. Paris was also home, as we know, to many revolutionary exiles. Remember, it was in Paris that Marx and Engels renewed their friendship. These exiles, these radical leaders, now argued that the opportunity was at hand to bring about revolution, not only against the Prussians, but also against the conservatives and the middle-class bourgeois elements who were willing to make peace with Prussia after Sedan. Ironically, Bismarck, eager to see France come to terms and to stabilize Europe, permitted elections to be held for a National Assembly. In Paris, though, the workers refused to accept the provisional government and instead established their government, the Paris Commune, as the representative government of an undefeated France. They elected members to run the city, and they opposed both the provisional government and the Prussians. The socialist radicals in the Commune were divided on how best to govern the city. The Provisional Government of National Defense, led by Thiers, signed a peace treaty with Prussia, and France was humiliated, ceding the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and paying a huge indemnity of 5 billion francs. But the Paris Commune refused to accept the treaty and forced Thiers to use the French army against the revolutionaries. In fact, the Prussian army withdrew and the French army simply took its place. And then the city itself was assaulted. In what has become known as Bloody Week, beginning on the 21st of May, 1871, the French army entered Paris and massacred as many as 25,000 communards, arresting 40,000 others and sending 10,000 of these to the French penal colonies. There was terrible bloodshed on both sides because it was really a civil war with barricades in the street and the revolutionaries struggling against the established French army. The hostages taken by the communards were all summarily shot, including the elderly Archbishop of Paris, and then there was the destruction of the city. The fire was lit throughout the historic part of Paris and the Palace of the Tuileries. That continuation of the great block of the Palace of the Louvre was completely destroyed, which is why today there are the gardens of the Tuileries, where once the great palace stood, having been burned down by the communards in 1871. The brutal repression of the Paris Commune signified the level of fear that property owners had developed once more for the revolutionaries. The last quarter of the 19th century, after all, was a time of preaching revolution. It was a time of Marx and those who said that revolution, rather than cooperating with the legitimate organs of government, would be the solution to the problems of the industrial working class. and these events were to have a significant influence over the next half-century. The humiliating defeat by the Prussians, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, and the bitter resentment of the Thiers government by the working classes meant that the new Republican regime was unstable and divided. But, ironically, the Third Republic was to last for 60 years, from 1875, when the Constitution was ratified, until 1940, when it was defeated in the Second World War, again by Germany. How was it then that this unstable, unpopular regime would represent one of the longest constitutional experiments in modern French history? Well, the Republic survived because the conservative monarchists, who made up much of the political class, couldn't agree on how to oppose the liberals, or who should lead their own faction, or how, in fact, they were to impose a monarchy on this government that seemed to be functioning. The real problem was that the monarchists were divided into three factions. The Legitimists, who wanted a return to the Bourbon family of Charles X, remember that ultra-reactionary who had been driven out of Paris in the 1830 Revolution. There were the Orleanists, who wanted a return of the more liberal branch of the Bourbon family, loyal to the heirs of Louis-Philippe, who had been overthrown in the 1848 Revolution. And then there were the Bonapartists, who agitated for the accession of the only son of Napoleon III, the Prince Imperial. The president of the Republic, strangely, was a monarchist, Patrice Mac-Mahon. Mac-Mahon wished for the return of a monarchy, but he saw that there was no agreement on who should be king. The death of Napoleon III's only son in 1875 during the Zulu Wars, fighting in Africa for the British, and the fact that the legitimist candidate was the last of his line, finally resulted in a monarchist compromise. The legitimist, who was to have the title of Henri V, Henry V, would become king, but because he had no children, the heirs of Louis-Philippe would succeed after his death, and the Henri V was in fact a man of a certain age. And things had reached the stage where there were arrangements for the coronation. The coronation coach was constructed, the coronation robes were made, but then everything collapsed. It collapsed when the putative Henri V, Henry V, revealed himself to be a dangerous reactionary. He was told that when he became king, he would then embrace the tricolor. He said, "Tiens, the tricolor, we must go back to the white field and the golden lilies of the Bourbons. That is the flag of the Ancien Régime, the flag of Louis XVI. And the rest of France said, "You're mad. This tricolor is the flag of Napoleon and the flag under which so many Frenchmen had died. We can't now go back in time and try and recreate the Ancien Régime." And Henry V, as he would be, said, "Sorry, if we can't have this flag, I refuse to be king." And in fact, it was on the issue of the flag that he did not become King of France. Thiers then remarked that the Republic survived because it divided France the least. Given their weakness and their victory by default, the Republicans then took the opportunity and spent much of the 1880s establishing laws that supported the symbols of the Republic. The Republic then became greater than any political faction. It became, in fact, the representation of France itself. It was then that La Marseillaise, that marching song of the revolutionaries from the south of France, became the national anthem. The 14th of July, the 14 Juillet, became Bastille Day, the national day of French celebration. And this, of course, created that veneration of the revolution a century after the event in order to support Republican government. In addition, the Republicans promulgated laws to protect freedom of the press and freedom of association. And in 1884, laws were passed permitting divorce and the institutionalization of secular public education, challenging the still formidable power of the Roman Catholic Church. We must remember that Charles X had tried to reinforce the Church in a recovery of that union of throne and altar that had characterized the Ancien Régime by giving land back to the Church, land that had been taken during the Revolution, and also giving the Church a certain amount of influence again over education. The conservatives, of course, were extremely unhappy with these laws, with this liberalization of the French state. And there were scandals, there was corruption and intrigue, and these constantly threatened the integrity of the Republic and indeed the state itself. In fact, it reached the stage that by the late 1880s and in 1890, as if a charismatic cavalry general named Georges Boulanger would effect a coup d'etat and repeat the careers of the two Napoleons by declaring himself dictator of France. But Boulanger was himself a Republican, and when the coup was expected, he instead rode to Brussels and blew out his brains on the grave of his dead mistress. Only in France. The Republic had survived, but while the Republic may have survived, it was only to face the greatest scandal in the history of modern France, the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, a young Jewish artillery officer, Alfred Dreyfus, from Alsace, so he spoke French with a slight German accent, was convicted of selling military secrets to the Germans. He was stripped of his commission, sent to Devil's Island for life. Dreyfus' conviction was used by the anti-Semites, the reactionary Catholics, the right-wing monarchists, and the right-wing military officers, and the conservative press to attack what they claimed as the moral bankruptcy of the Republic. 1898-99 witnessed an explosion of anti-Semitism, as well as anti-Protestant and anti-liberal agitation. The Dreyfus family fought to clear his name, but they received no support, no help whatsoever from the army, which refused to reopen the case, refusing to reopen the case even when the real traitor was discovered. However, a few courageous liberal and socialist writers and professional intellectuals took up Dreyfus's defense. These are known as the Dreyfusards, the supporters of Dreyfus, and they included the novelists Anatole France and Émile Zola, as well as the socialist politician and firebrand Georges Clemenceau, who would, of course, become prime minister at the end of the First World War. Zola published an open letter, J'accuse, in January of 1898, an accusation against the army, accusing the army of covering up this entire situation and refusing to recognize the evidence. The Army High Command then not only denied these accusations, but foolishly brought about charges of slander against Zola. It was unknown exactly how this was going to turn out. The army had powerful support, and indeed, what we can see, in fact, is that the army had powerful support not only within the military, but in fact within the conservative elements within society. But it proved to be a foolish decision, for Zola used his trial to prove Dreyfus's innocence. The Dreyfusards then were successful in their efforts to exonerate the officer. And in 1906, he was pardoned by the President of the Republic, and he was awarded the Legion of Honor. Well, why was this a defining moment in the history of modern France? Why is this Dreyfus affair one that still powerfully resonates to this day in the current debate in that country over things like religious symbols, headscarves, skull caps, crosses in schools, public buildings, and public life in general? The Dreyfus affair turned France legally into a secular state. The kinds of debates that we've been reading about taking place in France all reflect the fact that France is described in its constitution as a consequence of these events as a secular republic, and that no religious symbolism or no religious practice can in any way affect public life. So you can't in France today wear a headscarf if you're Muslim in a school or in a public building. You can't wear a skull cap if you're Jewish. You can't have a large cross. You can have a small one, but it's supposed to be covered. In other words, the idea of la laïcité, of secularism, is now part of French society, and it's really the consequence of the Dreyfus affair. Because the Dreyfus affair undermined the power of the conservative elements within society, the monarchists, the army, the church, and so many of the leading figures of the government. This then led to the disestablishment of the Roman Catholic Church, completing at the turn of the 20th century the work that the French Revolution had begun, defining France and making France in practice, required by law, a secular society. The monarchists in the Chamber of Deputies were discredited. The anti-Dreyfusards and the right-wing militarists and monarchist officers in the army were neutralized or cashiered. After 1906, France emerged then as a secular, republican society which had isolated and alienated many of the most powerful elements on the right, the traditional powers in French culture and French life. But these conservative forces would erupt again as anti-democratic, reactionary forces after World War I, and especially during the Vichy regime after the French defeat in 1940. As the right was weakened, the left then became resurgent, with the growth of the socialist labor movement after 1880. While doctrinaire Marxists argue that accommodation with the government was unthinkable, especially after the events of the Paris Commune of 1871, when they believed the opportunity for revolution had been suppressed, French democratic socialists, particularly the charismatic Jean Jaurès, sought to establish a working-class party modeled on that of the German Social Democratic Party. The Republic, however, remained hostile to the socialists in many ways because it was still a party of the middle class. It had liberal associations and it had liberal motives, but it still was a power representing property. And the government then did its best to suppress strikes, those strikes especially that were launched against the state and state concerns. All of this culminated in 1910 with the crushing of a national railway strike. So it appeared then by 1914 that the Third Republic represented only the middle-class, urban, moderate, liberal Republicans. It had alienated the socialist workers. It had completely alienated the conservatives, the army, the nationalists, the monarchists, and the Roman Catholic Church. Tragically, it was this government that would have to lead the country through one of the greatest trials in all of French history, the First World War. As France experienced upheavals and dislocation, Germany, its greatest enemy, was in a very different position. Confident, stable, united, growing in power and influence, growing economically, growing militarily, challenging Britain and the other great powers for supremacy almost on earth. The German Empire that emerged in 1871 had been built on established Prussian institutions, with new imperial traditions created to give the impression of a more centralized state. The emperor, or Kaiser, had the right to decree legislation, he had the right to conduct foreign affairs personally, and he acted as commander-in-chief of the German army and navy. However, the lower house of the German parliament, the Reichstag, could refuse passage of the budget, making the emperor's powers irrelevant. And the lower house, remember, was elected by universal manhood suffrage, considered very politically advanced when compared with the practice in the other European states. The imperial civil service, the bureaucracy that ran the empire, was largely populated in its upper echelons with the younger sons of the nobility and the wealthy elite. It was instilled with a high degree of professionalism, nationalism, dedication to duty, highly skilled, well-educated, and committed to the idea of the Reich, the empire representing the German people. The German Empire then ran efficiently and effectively, and Bismarck's very liberal social legislation gave ordinary Germans of all classes, but especially the poor, a sense of belonging and strong national feeling. Even the socialists were brought into this sense that they benefited simply by being German. Bismarck, nevertheless, embarked upon two policies to weaken the appeal of the two potentially competing organizations to the omnicompetent empire that he had created. He recognized that the Roman Catholic Church and the Socialist Party had natural bases of power, natural authority and influence that could detract from the authority that he wanted the emperor to wield alone. So he decided to neutralize them. He first attacked the Catholic Church with his Kulturkampf, or culture war. In this, he was supported by the liberals, who wanted to free the state of religious influence and any connections whatsoever to Rome. Bismarck wanted the imperial state to assume authority over every aspect of German life, and he knew the Roman Catholic Church stood in his way. So in 1873, Bismarck enacted legislation to reduce the influence of the church. He diminished the role of church schools, and even priests were to be trained by state colleges rather than Catholic religious seminaries. Catholic marriages were not recognized as valid unions. There would have to be civil unions as well for two people to actually be married in law. Significantly, those churchmen who opposed these reforms were to be exiled, put them out so they could no longer disrupt the state. Well, the Catholic response was interesting. The Catholic response was not to yield, but to form their own political party, which attracted wide support, surprisingly wide support, even among non-Catholics, because many Germans, regardless of their religion, resented what they saw as an attack on religious freedom. Consequently, the centrist Catholic Party won seats in the Reichstag in the election of 1874. And conservative Lutheran East Prussian Junkers, that is the landed nobility of Bismarck's own class, supported the Catholics against Bismarck because they believed that Bismarck's government was undermining tradition and, more dangerously, property rights, as well as the moral fiber of the empire. So eventually, Bismarck was forced to back down, and only the laws regarding secular schools and civil marriage remained. But if Bismarck suffered defeat, so too did the liberals. The liberals had supported his proposals to reduce the civil rights of nearly 40% of their fellow Germans. This indicated that their nationalism and their respect for authority far outweighed their commitment to liberal principles, an attitude that we'll see sadly repeated in the Weimar Republic after World War I. Simultaneously, with his assault on the Catholic Church, Bismarck began planning an attack on the socialists, a few years later beginning his assault on the structure of the German Social Democratic Party. The socialists who, despite their Marxist roots, had decided to work, remember, within the German state, because German workers were nationalists before they were socialists. However, an opportunity was offered by two quixotic attempts on the life of the Emperor William I in 1878 by anarchists. Bismarck now had an excuse to move against the socialists because he lumped anarchists and socialists together in the same box. They were all revolutionaries and they all threatened the integrity of the state. So Bismarck banned the meetings and newspapers of the socialists. The state introduced social legislation, as we've seen, to weaken the attraction of the Social Democratic Party, offering in its place a paternalistic Reich. But, as with the Catholics, political action proved to be Bismarck's undoing. The workers continued to vote for the Social Democratic candidate for the Reichstag. The socialists actually increased their numbers. They had no newspapers or meetings, but they then sponsored youth groups, athletic clubs, nationalist cultural organizations and associations to spread and instill Marxist socialism among the youth of Germany. And one of the sad ironies of this is that these clubs and organizations survived, and many of them after the war would then be used as recruiting grounds for future Nazis. By 1912, the Social Democrats had achieved the most seats in the Reichstag, and again, Bismarck had failed. In general, the Imperial German government worked for those groups that supported it most fervently: the landowning nobility, the nationalists, the military, and the civil service, together, of course, with the great industrialists like Krupp, who was producing Germany's growing arsenal of weapons. This stability was reinforced by the progress evident for all citizens in the standard of living, which continued to improve. The population rose by 50% in the 20 years between 1882 and 1902, with the industrial labor force of Germany rising to 27 million workers, second in number only to that of Great Britain. But this required huge numbers of peasants to leave their farms for the cities to work in the factories. They were dislocated from their former agricultural communities. They lacked experience of urban life. They lacked experience of the wider world or much education. But the German Empire, as long as it survived, provided them with accident and health insurance, old age pensions, and instilled a powerful nationalism. But as we'll see, when World War I swept away the empire, all that was left was the nationalism and anger that this paternalistic state that had functioned so well for them had been destroyed by enemies without, and increasingly, they believed, enemies within. In an act of egotistical bravado in 1890, the new young emperor, William II, dismissed Bismarck as chancellor. William is a curious personality. His father, the Emperor Friedrich, just reigned for a few months and died of cancer unfortunately because he was married to a daughter of Queen Victoria, and he was a very intelligent and polished man. Young Wilhelm was not only young, he had a withered arm, and he felt he had to prove himself. And so he began acting in a somewhat proud and ambitious manner in order to indicate that he too would be a great emperor. This Kaiser embarked upon a policy of imperial, diplomatic, and military expansion that reinforced Germany as the most powerful state on the continent. But he did so in such a way as to increasingly raise fears amongst the British and the French. Once more, the personality of an emperor in William II began creating the preconditions for the First World War in 1914 and undoing some of the policies that Bismarck had put in place in order to ensure that if such a war should ever come, Germany would only have to fight on one front. In Central Europe, the other great composite empire, linked in alliance with Germany, was the Habsburg-Austrian Empire. It had become the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867, with the Hungarians given full partnership in the empire, in part as a result of the defeat of the Austrians by the Prussians in 1866. Apart from the Austrians and the Hungarians, the empire was a huge mix of nationalities, comprising the present-day Czech and Slovak republics, parts of Poland, parts of former Yugoslavia, including Slovenia, Croatia, part of Serbia, as well as parts of what is now Romania and Ukraine. Dealing with this national question was never easy, especially when the Hungarians were given equality with the Austrians in 1867, because then every group wanted some measure of self-determination. But the dual monarchy had no clear policy after 1867, shifting between centralizing the empire and providing rights to minorities. Initially, there wasn't even a single parliament in the empire. Internal affairs were handled by separate governments in Vienna and Budapest, with only minimal discussions on common policies. After 1860, Austria-Hungary underwent, moreover, a period of heightened, telescoped industrialization, which was concentrated in the Czech areas of the empire, in Silesia, and in Hungary itself. And when industrialization occurred, it brought with it all of the same issues that Western Europe had witnessed previously: poor working conditions, fast urban growth, the creation of new classes and socialist political parties. So the last quarter of the 19th century witnessed the same kinds of polarization in Austria-Hungary that had occurred in Western Europe, between left and right. Liberalism and socialism crept into the political debates in the empire, and when coupled with the nationalities issue, they threatened to split the dual monarchy. Also, rather than capitalizing on the issues that superseded national divisions in the empire, like social legislation or developing a more representative central parliament in Vienna, the Habsburgs continually fell back on the problem they knew, despite its intractability, the national question. It was really affection for the old Emperor Franz Joseph, who had come to the throne in 1848 as a consequence of the revolutions of that year, that kept the empire united. But an old monarch was insufficient to cement together the competing ambitions and the policies of this curious polyglot Central European empire. And the forces that jeopardized its unity would emerge with explosive intensity in the context of war and defeat in 1918. The state of Europe then, in the years immediately before the First World War, was anything but stable, anything but settled. The problems that existed were extreme in some areas like Austria-Hungary. The problems in Germany had largely been overcome, but they were being, again, stimulated by the actions of a somewhat quixotic emperor. The situation in France was one of anger and division, still looking for some kind of national reconciliation that would allow them to address the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. The situation in Britain was one of rising fear of the power of Germany. So before 1914, the situation then was one of continual instability, where small events could spark the kind of Armageddon that ultimately did explode in 1914. Although everyone was aware of it, although all of these problems were known under popular discussion internally and externally, no one seemed to be able to do anything about it. And indeed, as we'll see when war finally came in the next lecture, it seemed to many people to be the inevitable result of what had gone before. but only when the war actually began did they realize that they in fact had unleashed a force that would ultimately, completely and totally destroy the world that they had known.